The French Revolution casts a colossal shadow over modern history. It was not merely a French event, it was a global earthquake, sending tremors that reshaped our understanding of liberty, equality, and what it means to be a nation. Imagine, if you will, a monarchy that had stood for centuries, its power seemingly ordained by God himself, suddenly and violently brought crashing down by the very people it ruled. This profound transformation from a system deemed unshakable to the unthinkable reality of its collapse raises a compelling question. How could such a monumental upheaval occur? Picture this. A world totally cut off from the everyday worries of normal people. This was the special world of the rich nobles and important church leaders in France right before the big revolution started. Everything for them, what they hoped for, even who they were, was centered on the giant, beautiful palace of Versailles. This palace was a huge sign of the king's complete power and incredible wealth. Here, far away from the tough life of the country they were meant to help run, they lived in a kind of golden cage full of special treatment. It seemed like they didn't see, or maybe didn't care about, the growing unhappiness just outside their fancy gold gates. The church leaders and the nobles, called the First and Second Estates, had amazing special rights, so many it's hard for us to believe now. Together, they owned a lot of France's best land and richest property, and guess what? They paid almost no taxes. So who paid for the country, its expensive wars, and the super fancy royal court? Well, that heavy load fell mostly on other people, not the nobles or clergy. These rich and powerful groups had special legal and political powers that were very hard to question. They usually got their important jobs just by being born into the right family, not because they earned them. This created a system that was stuck and made it really hard for things to change or for ordinary people to get ahead. So what was daily life like for a top noble? It was like a complicated dance with very strict rules, always trying to get favors, and having lots of time for fancy fun. Their days were packed with fancy ceremonies at court, big hunts in the royal forests, amazing parties that lasted all night, and always trying to stay in the king's good graces. They mostly worried about their social standing, getting support from the king, and the tricky, sometimes dangerous power games played inside the exclusive world of Versailles. This incredibly fancy lifestyle? It was all built on the hard work of millions of ordinary people, work that was never seen or given credit. This basic truth about money was easy for the nobles to ignore while they chased after fancy fun and political games. But the really important question, one that floated in the air of their rich homes but was never spoken, was this: how long could such an unfair system really last? While these nobles enjoyed their amazing lives, feeling safe and thinking God wanted them on top, the very base of their world was quietly but definitely wearing away beneath them. This huge, obvious gap between their wild spending on luxuries and the country's money problems getting worse and worse created a very dangerous situation. It was like a ticking clock, counting down to a huge, unknown disaster. Didn't they hear the distant sounds of ordinary people growing more and more unhappy at Gap 2S? Or did they just decide to ignore it, feeling so safe and sure that their world couldn't be shaken by the changes that were on their way? Now, let us turn our gaze from the glittering halls of power to the other France, the France of the vast, diverse and increasingly restive Third Estate. This enormous segment of society, comprising over 97% of the total population, included everyone from the most impoverished peasant farmer to the rising bourgeoisie. They bore the crushing weight of the kingdom's financial burdens, facing relentless labour, feudal dues, tithes and royal taxes. Urban workers endured long hours for low wages, often living in overcrowded slums. Food shortages and high bread prices led to widespread despair and unrest. The cry for bread was the loudest expression of popular anger. The government seemed unable to address their plight, fueling hopelessness. Amidst this, the bourgeoisie gained prominence, excluded from privileges but crucial to the revolutionary storm. Like and subscribe now. Before the great storm of revolution erupted, French society was rigidly defined. It was a kingdom of orders, not of equal citizens. At the very pinnacle of this ancient structure resided the aristocracy. These were the members of the First Estate, the high clergy, and the Second Estate, the nobility. Numerically, they constituted a mere sliver of France's populace, perhaps no more than 2% of the entire nation. Yet their influence, their wealth and their privileges were almost boundless, shaping the lives of millions beneath them in ways both profound and often deeply resented by the unprivileged masses. This elevated status was not typically earned through individual merit or hard work. It was, for the most part, a matter of birthright, an accident of lineage. Noble titles and the vast estates accompanying them were inherited. They passed from father to son, generation after generation, for centuries. This system fostered a powerful belief in inherent superiority. It created a sense of being fundamentally different, almost a separate race from the common people. Their world was exclusive, a closed circle. Entry for an outsider was exceptionally rare, reinforcing their collective sense of unique identity and shared destiny within the kingdom. The French legal system itself enshrined and protected their exalted position. Nobles and high clergy were often subject to different laws and different courts. They enjoyed specific legal protections unavailable to the commoner. Penalties for crimes could vary wildly based on social rank. This legal separation was a constant, visible reminder of the deep inequalities. It underscored the fundamental injustice that a person's station at birth determined their rights and their treatment. Such a system was designed to maintain their dominance. It was a bulwark against any challenge to their established order, ensuring their continued control. Their psychological world was as distinct as their legal one. Many genuinely believed in their natural right to rule, to command, and to enjoy luxury. This conviction was often reinforced by religious doctrine and philosophical justifications of the era. They saw the existing social hierarchy not as an injustice, but as a divinely ordained and natural order. This profound self-assurance, this unshakable belief in their own superiority, would make it incredibly difficult for them to comprehend the scale of the grievances brewing below. It created a dangerous complacency, a fatal inability to see the cracks appearing in the very foundations of their opulent world. Versailles was the gilded cage of power and pleasure. The palace of Versailles was the glittering epicenter of this aristocratic world. It was a dazzling symbol of absolute monarchy and a stage for courtly life. Nobles vied for royal favor, influence and power. Life was a constant performance, governed by rigid etiquette. Every interaction was meticulously prescribed. Banished nobles faced social and political death. Extravagant diversions masked the grim realities outside. This disconnect would prove to be a fatal flaw. The immense wealth of the French aristocracy was primarily rooted in land. The nobility and the church, the First and Second Estates, collectively owned a staggering proportion of France's territory. Some estimates suggest they held between 30 to 40% of all land. These vast estates, often encompassing entire villages and sprawling agricultural tracts, had been accumulated over centuries. They were passed down through hereditary lines, consolidating wealth and power in the hands of a relatively small number of families. This land was not just a source of income. It was a symbol of status and authority, the very bedrock of their dominance. From these extensive landholdings, the aristocracy extracted significant income through ancient feudal rights and dues. Peasants living on noble lands were often obligated to pay a variety of taxes and tributes to their lord. These could include a portion of their harvest, the fees for using the lord's mill, oven or wine press, and unpaid labour service. While feudalism as a complete system was fading, these remnants persisted. They were a constant source of irritation and financial strain for the peasantry. These dues were deeply resented as unjust and archaic burdens. Perhaps the most significant and galling privilege enjoyed by the nobility was their exemption from many forms of direct taxation. The major land tax fell most heavily on the peasantry and the urban commoners. Most nobles were entirely exempt from it. The clergy, as the first estate, also contributed very little in direct taxes to the royal treasury, instead offering a periodic free gift, the amount of which they largely determined themselves. This fiscal immunity was a cornerstone of aristocratic privilege. It was fiercely guarded as a mark of their superior status and independence from common obligations. The consequences of this lopsided fiscal system were dire for the French state and its people. As the nobility and clergy shouldered a minimal share of the tax burden, the entire weight of funding the kingdom fell upon the Third Estate. This included the impoverished peasants, struggling urban workers, and the increasingly frustrated bourgeoisie. This profound injustice bred deep and widespread resentment. It became a central grievance as the kingdom lurched towards financial collapse. The idea that the wealthiest contributed the least was becoming intolerable to a growing number of French citizens, fueling demands for radical reform. Don't forget to like and subscribe now. The prevailing mindset within much of the French aristocracy was one of ingrained entitlement. They genuinely believed they were born to rule, that their privileges were a natural and just reward for their noble lineage. This worldview was often reinforced by the church and by deeply entrenched social customs. The rigid hierarchy of society, with the monarch at its apex and the commoners at its base, was seen as an immutable order, ordained by God and proven by time. Any suggestion that this order was unfair or unsustainable was often met with incomprehension or outright hostility. Their position felt secure, almost eternal. This sense of inherent superiority fostered a significant lack of empathy or even basic understanding for the plight of the common people. While some individual nobles might have been aware of poverty in a general sense, they rarely grasped its true depth or systemic nature. The daily struggles for bread, the crushing weight of taxes, the desperation of families facing starvation, these realities were often abstract concepts to those living in chateaux and palaces. Poverty was frequently dismissed as an inevitable part of the human condition, or even as a consequence of the laziness or moral failings of the poor themselves, rather than a result of systemic exploitation. Acts of charity by individual aristocrats did occur, of course. Some nobles and their families might distribute food to the local poor on feast days. Some might support local religious institutions that offered aid. However, these gestures, while perhaps well-intentioned in some cases, were entirely insufficient to address the scale of the suffering. They were piecemeal efforts, never challenging the underlying structures of inequality that perpetuated poverty. Often such charity was more a matter of social expectation or a way to display one's virtue, rather than a genuine commitment to systemic change or social justice. This profound disconnect, this chasm of experience and understanding between the elite and the masses, created a fatal vulnerability. The aristocracy, cocooned in their world of privilege and protocol, largely failed to perceive the growing intensity of popular anger. They underestimated the power of the new Enlightenment ideas, questioning the very basis of their authority. They heard the distant rumblings of discontent, but dismissed them as inconsequential noise, not the harbingers of a revolutionary earthquake. Their world, which seemed so solid and unshakable to them, was, in reality, perilously fragile and on the verge of shattering completely. Don't forget to like and subscribe now. The unseen engine that is shouldering a kingdom's weight remains unseen. While the aristocracy revelled in their inherited splendour, another France, vast and essential, toiled in obscurity. This was the Third Estate, the colossal base upon which the entire edifice of the Ancien Regime precariously rested. It encompassed an immense diversity of people, the countless peasants who tilled the soil, the skilled urban artisans like masons, weavers and blacksmiths who crafted the nation's goods, the small shopkeepers who lined the bustling city streets, and the domestic servants who attended to the needs of the wealthy. It also included the rapidly expanding bourgeoisie, ambitious merchants, learned lawyers, dedicated doctors, and influential writers. Numerically, they were France itself, comprising over 97% of the population, yet their monumental contribution went largely unacknowledged, their voices systematically suppressed. Their relentless labour fueled the kingdom's economy, and their taxes desperately tried to fill its perpetually depleted coffers, but they were consistently denied any meaningful share of power or respect, a fundamental imbalance that could not endure indefinitely. Life for the French peasant, the backbone of this third estate, was an exhausting cycle of unceasing labour, often for little reward beyond mere subsistence. They were ensnared in the lingering remnants of an archaic feudal system, a complex web of obligations owed to local lords and the distant church. Specific dues, such as a monetary rent for the land they farmed, and a significant portion of their precious harvest, ate away at their meagre earnings. The lord often held monopolies, known as forcing peasants to pay for the use of his mill to grind their grain, his oven to bake their bread, or his wine press. Furthermore, the demanded days of unpaid labour from them, maintaining the kingdom's roads for the benefit of others. This constant debilitating drain of resources and energy left peasant families perpetually impoverished, working land they rarely owned outright, with scant hope for a better future for their children. In the burgeoning towns and cities, the urban worker faced a different yet equally harsh set of challenges. The Faubourg Saint-Antoine in Paris, for example, was a sprawling district teeming with artisans and labourers, living in cramped, often squalid tenements. Their workdays were punishingly long, frequently stretching from 12 to 16 hours in dimly lit workshops or small, unregulated manufactories. The wages they received were often barely sufficient to cover the bare necessities of food and shelter, leaving them perilously vulnerable to the slightest increase in prices or any period of unemployment, which was a constant threat. Many unskilled workers lacked the protection of traditional guilds, leaving them at the mercy of their employers. The air in these overcrowded neighbourhoods was thick with the noise of workshops, the smells of inadequate sanitation, and the ever-present danger of contagious diseases, a stark contrast to the manicured estates of the nobility. The most universally felt injustice, however, was the crushing and disproportionate burden of taxation. The Third Estate alone bore the brunt of direct taxes, like a heavy tax on land and peasant produce, theoretically an income tax but one from which nobles often found exemptions, and a poll tax supposedly on every head but applied with far greater rigour to commoners. Worse still were the hated indirect taxes, an exorbitantly priced and compulsory salt tax, essential for food preservation, and the levied on everyday items like wine, oil and livestock. These taxes were collected by private tax farmers who paid the state a lump sum and then ruthlessly extracted as much as possible from the populace to maximise their own profits. The sheer unfairness of this system, watching the wealthiest orders, the clergy and nobility, remain largely exempt while they themselves were bled dry, was a daily, infuriating reminder of their subjugation. A life of scarcity and the spectre of hunger and hardship. For the Third Estate, poverty was a constant companion shaping every aspect of their existence. A single bad harvest or illness could plunge a family into destitution. There were no reliable social safety nets. Desperate beggars, gaunt vagrants and abandoned children were common sights. Anxiety about the next meal was pervasive. Bread was the staff of life, often 3/4 of daily caloric intake. The price of bread was a sensitive barometer of public mood. Minor price fluctuations had dramatic consequences. Sparse shelves or high prices led to fear and anger. Affordable bread was a fundamental expectation. Famine cast a long shadow over pre-revolutionary France. Poor harvests led to critical grain shortages. Scarcity drove prices sky high, leading to hoarding and starvation. The government's response was often seen as inadequate. Desperation led to violent bread riots. These were desperate cries for survival. Overcrowded tenements contributed to daily hardship. Families lived in narrow, winding alleyways. Dwellings were dark, damp and poorly ventilated. Clean drinking water was a luxury. Poor sanitation bred devastating diseases. High child mortality underscored societal inequities. The The silent majority was political voicelessness and impotence. The Third Estate, despite being the majority, had no political voice. The Estates General hadn't convened since 1614, royal decrees ruled, favouring nobility. Commoners felt alienated, ruled by the state. Local lords and officials held power, often unjustly. The system bred frustration and cynicism. The average citizen, despite their work ethic, were excluded from power, fueling discontent and calls for change. Decades of economic hardship and social injustice created a vast reservoir of anger within the Third Estate. This was a long, slow burn, touching nearly every peasant, artisan and bourgeois family. The daily struggle for survival, juxtaposed with the luxury of the privileged few, created a potent cocktail of envy and frustration. This discontent formed the fertile ground for revolution, taking root with astonishing speed. Everyday encounters served as constant reminders of systemic inequities, stoking the fires of indignation. Imagine the peasant farmer whose meagre crops represented his family's hope, watching helplessly as a nobleman's hunting party trampled his fields. Picture the urban artisan struggling to make ends meet, forced to pay the exorbitant salt tax. Envision the desperate parent, unable to afford bread, while tales of lavish banquets at Versailles spread. These were deeply personal injustices, fueling a burning righteous anger. Slowly, a collective consciousness emerged among the Third Estate. Though separated by occupation and geography, they found common cause in their shared oppression. Localized protests demonstrated a growing willingness to challenge the established order. Illicit pamphlets spread radical Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and equality. The notion that the common people constituted the nation took firm root. Hopelessness gave way to a fervent hope for something new and better. What if taxation was fair, according to one's ability to pay? What if laws applied equally to all citizens? What if ordinary people had a genuine say in governance? These questions, once unthinkable, were now openly discussed. The ground was fertile, ready for revolutionary seeds, promising transformative change. The road to revolution was paved with empty royal coffers. France, in the decades leading up to 1789, teetered on the brink of financial collapse. Generations of fiscal mismanagement and extravagant spending by the monarchy led to an unsustainable system of taxation. The kingdom's treasury was hemorrhaging money, its debts mounting to astronomical figures. This dire economic reality formed a crucial backdrop to the unfolding social and political drama. The state's inability to manage its finances effectively became a glaring symbol of its broader incompetence. A significant portion of this debt stemmed from France's involvement in costly wars throughout the 18th century. The 7 Years' War had been particularly devastating for the French treasury. The monarchy borrowed heavily to finance these conflicts. Unlike Great Britain, France struggled to service these enormous debts. The interest payments consumed an ever larger share of the state's annual revenue. Supporting the American colonists added well over £1 billion to the national debt. This intervention brought no direct financial recompense to the French crown. Instead, France was left with even more crippling debt. Soldiers returning from America brought with them republican ideals and revolutionary fervor. These ideas resonated powerfully in a France already groaning under its own systemic burdens. The deeply inequitable taxation system prevented any meaningful resolution to the debt crisis. The First and Second Estates, the clergy and the nobility, were largely exempt from most direct taxes. The burden of funding the state fell almost entirely upon the Third Estate. This group, from impoverished peasants to the rising bourgeoisie, was being squeezed dry. Successive royal ministers attempted fiscal reform but were blocked by the privileged orders. This deadlock ensured that the kingdom continued its inexorable slide towards bankruptcy. Don't forget to like and subscribe for history, geopolitics, economics, and more. Alongside the crippling national debt, a series of devastating natural calamities struck at the very heart of French society, its food supply. The 1780s witnessed an alarming succession of poor harvests, often triggered by severe weather conditions. Brutal winters, prolonged spring droughts, and destructive summer hailstorms ravaged crops across the country. Some historians also point to the climatic effects of the Laki volcanic eruption in Iceland in 1783, which spewed vast quantities of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, potentially altering weather patterns across Europe for several years. Whatever the precise combination of causes, the result was a catastrophic decline in agricultural output, particularly of grain, the staple food for the vast majority of the French population. The granaries were emptying and the spectre of famine loomed large. The most immediate and devastating consequence of these harvest failures was a dramatic surge in the price of bread. As grain supplies dwindled, its cost skyrocketed, often doubling or even tripling in a matter of months. For the urban poor and the peasantry, who already spent a disproportionate share of their meagre incomes on bread, this inflation was catastrophic. Families who could barely afford food in normal times were now pushed to the very brink of starvation. The cry for bread became a desperate, ubiquitous plea. This widespread hunger fueled intense social unrest, leading to numerous bread riots in towns and cities across France. Angry crowds, often led by women, would confront bakers, seize grain convoys, and demand that food be sold at what they considered a just price, reflecting a deep-seated moral economy. The government's response to this escalating food crisis was widely perceived as woefully inadequate, further eroding public trust and fueling popular anger. Efforts to import grain were often too little, too late, hampered by poor infrastructure and bureaucratic inefficiency. Conspiracy theories abounded, accusing wealthy speculators, grain merchants, and even members of the nobility of deliberately hoarding grain to drive up prices and profit from the misery of the masses. The infamous Pacte de Famine, famine pact theory, which suggested a deliberate plot by the elite to starve the population, gained considerable traction, illustrating the profound distrust between the people and their rulers. The perceived indifference of the court at Versailles to the suffering in the provinces only intensified the sense of outrage and abandonment. This pervasive hunger and the desperate struggle for basic sustenance became a powerful catalyst for revolutionary sentiment. When people are starving, their patience for abstract political debates wears thin, and their willingness to challenge the established order increases dramatically. The food crisis made the inequities of the Ancien regime starkly visible. While the common people starved, the aristocracy continued to enjoy lives of conspicuous luxury. Hunger transformed abstract grievances about taxation and representation into an immediate visceral struggle for survival. It stripped away any remaining veneer of legitimacy from a government that could not fulfill its most basic duty, to ensure its people had enough to eat. The empty stomachs of the French populace cried out for radical change, making them far more receptive to the revolutionary message. The winds of change meant Enlightenment ideas challenged the old order. Economic hardship and hunger pushed the French towards desperation, while the Enlightenment provided ideas to challenge the Ancien regime. The Enlightenment championed reason, science, and individual rights over tradition and dogma. Thinkers like Rousseau and Montesquieu argued for popular sovereignty and separation of powers. Voltaire attacked religious intolerance and aristocratic abuses. These ideas seeped into French consciousness, undermining the monarchy and privileged orders. The Enlightenment provided the intellectual ammunition for revolution, transforming resentment into a call for change. A faltering crown was the failure of royal leadership. King Louis XVI, ascending in 1774, faced a nation in debt and social unrest. Despite good intentions, his indecisiveness and reliance on conservative advisors hindered reforms. Reformers like Turgot and Necker proposed changes, but faced fierce opposition. Marie Antoinette's extravagance further damaged the monarchy's reputation. The monarchy's failure to reform led to a crisis of legitimacy, paving the way for revolution. Don't forget to like and subscribe now. A distant thunder for the American experiment ignites imagination. Across the Atlantic, the American Revolution captivated France, igniting debates in Parisian salons and coffee houses. The ideals of liberty, equality and self-governance resonated deeply, inspiring hope for change. The American success showed revolution against monarchy was achievable, inspiring the French. France's involvement in the American Revolutionary War went beyond support. Thousands of French soldiers, led by commanders like Lafayette, fought alongside the Americans. They returned home transformed, carrying revolutionary ideas. These experiences planted seeds of change, challenging the French monarchy and inspiring calls for reform. The soldiers' stories added a personal dimension to the Enlightenment principles, setting the stage for the French Revolution. The French monarchy's decision to support the American Revolution was a strategic move to weaken Britain. King Louis XVI and Comte de Vergennes aimed to restore French prestige. While some nobles supported the American cause, the main goal was power politics. The war effort strained France's finances, costing over 1 billion livres. France's support included a naval fleet, troops and supplies. Significant loans and subsidies were extended to America. Ironically, aiding American freedom hastened France's financial ruin. The monarchy's spending led to social upheaval and discontent. Don't forget to like and subscribe now. The American Revolution demonstrated that Enlightenment ideals could become political reality. A new nation was founded on popular sovereignty, individual rights and representative government. This model inspired those in France seeking a just society. It showed that people could break free from oppression and build a new system based on liberty. The American Revolution acted as an ideological spark for the French Revolution. It provided a vision of a society free from monarchical absolutism. The echoes of American liberty played a role in the French Revolution. The spark of freedom lit in America ignited a conflagration in Europe. The year 1789 dawned upon a France teetering on the edge of monumental change. King Louis XVI, facing financial ruin and popular discontent, summoned the Estates General, an assembly that hadn't met since 1614. Delegates from the three societal orders, the clergy, the nobility and the Third Estate, converged on Versailles in May 1789. A dispute over voting procedures arose, with the Third Estate demanding voting by head. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, representing the sovereign will of the French nation. Barred from their meeting hall, they reconvened in a nearby tennis court and took the historic tennis court oath. Meanwhile, in Paris, tensions reached a boiling point. On July 14, 1789, a crowd stormed the Bastille, marking the definitive entry of popular violence into the revolution. The fall of the Bastille shattered royal control over Paris and sent shockwaves across France and Europe. The revolution had begun. The storming of the Bastille unleashed a wave of popular action across France. In the countryside, peasants rose up in what became known as the Great Fear. On August 4, 1789, liberal nobles renounced their feudal privileges, dismantling the feudal system in a single night. The National Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen on August 26, 1789. Despite these changes, King Louis XVI remained hesitant and resistant. In October 1789, thousands of Parisian women marched on Versailles, compelling the royal family to return to Paris. The National Assembly continued drafting a constitution, establishing a constitutional monarchy. The civil constitution of the clergy in July 1790 subordinated the Catholic Church to the state, creating counter-revolutionary sentiment. The king's authority eroded as the assembly stripped away the monarchy's traditional powers. The revolution struggled to define its future path. The uneasy compromise of a constitutional monarchy was shattered by King Louis XVI's actions. In June 1791, The king and his family attempted to flee France, but were apprehended at Varennes. This flight demonstrated the king's duplicity and unwillingness to accept revolutionary changes. Calls for the abolition of the monarchy grew louder. In April 1792, France declared war on Austria and Prussia. On August 10, 1792, revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries Palace, leading to the suspension of the king. The National Convention abolished the monarchy and proclaimed the First French Republic on September 21, 1792. King Louis XVI was found guilty of treason and executed on January 21, 1793. His execution sent shockwaves across Europe. 9 months later, Marie Antoinette met the same fate. With the king executed and France at war, the revolution took a brutal turn. In April 1793, the National Convention established the Committee of Public Safety. Maximilien Robespierre became its most influential member, arguing that terror was necessary to protect the revolution. The Reign of Terror from September 1793 to July 1794 saw the guillotine claim tens of thousands of lives. Revolutionary tribunals tried suspects with little regard for due process. The terror consumed not only counter-revolutionaries, but also revolutionaries who fell foul of Robespierre. By the summer of 1794, many within the National Convention feared Robespierre's growing power. On July 27, 1794, Robespierre was arrested. The following day, he was executed by guillotine. His death marked the end of the Reign of Terror and initiated the Thermidorian reaction. Following the fall of Robespierre, the Thermidorian Convention sought to steer France away from radicalism. In 1795, a new constitution established the Directory, a more conservative republic. The Directory faced immense challenges, including economic instability and political unrest. Amidst this turmoil, Napoleon Bonaparte rose through the military ranks. His victories in Italy transformed him into a national hero. The Directory's weaknesses and reliance on the army paved the way for its downfall. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon executed a coup d'état, overthrowing the Directory. He established the consulate, with himself as first consul. This coup marked the end of the revolutionary decade. The revolution's ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity continued to shape France's future under Napoleon's rule. The French Revolution targeted the Catholic Church, a powerful landowner and political force. Revolutionaries nationalized church lands in 1789 to alleviate state debt. The civil constitution of the clergy in 1790 reorganized the church. Clergy had to swear loyalty to the nation, splitting French society. Pope Pius VI condemned the civil constitution, fueling counter-revolutionary sentiment. During the Reign of Terror, the revolution's de-Christianization campaign aimed to eradicate Christianity, closing churches, repurposing buildings and destroying religious symbols. Priests faced persecution, and a new secular calendar replaced the Gregorian one. The movement was divisive, sparking resistance, especially in rural areas. Ultimately, the effort to erase religious tradition failed, highlighting the limits of revolutionary power. The French Revolution shattered the Ancien Regime, dismantling the monarchy and hereditary privilege. France reimagined its identity, striving for a unified nation of equal citizens. New laws embodied revolutionary ideals of universal citizenship and legal equality. The revolution's spirit of nationalism and secularism profoundly shaped French identity. Popular sovereignty endured, challenging absolute rule and systemic injustice. Beyond the immediate political upheavals and the dramatic redrawing of France's governmental structures, the French Revolution fundamentally reshaped the very soul and intricate fabric of the nation. The comprehensive abolition of ancient feudal dues and the significant redistribution of some land particularly the vast estates formerly held by the church, permanently altered the landscape of rural society and the prevailing patterns of land ownership. The crucial administrative reforms, such as the rational creation of the départements as uniform administrative units, provided a more logical and centralized governmental structure that, remarkably, persists in France to this very day. The new legal codes introduced during this period, culminating in the highly influential Napoleonic Code, enshrined principles of legal equality and profoundly shaped civil law systems not only in France, but across large swathes of the globe. The French Revolution did not and could not remain a purely French affair. Its electrifying ideals and its powerful example resonated with extraordinary force across the European continent and indeed throughout the wider world for many centuries that followed. It served as an incredibly potent and enduring source of direct inspiration for countless subsequent revolutionary movements, for numerous nationalist uprisings passionately seeking self-determination and an end to foreign domination, and for legions of reformers tirelessly campaigning for democratic rights and greater social justice in their own lands. The clarion calls for liberty, equality, fraternity echoed profoundly in the arduous struggles of oppressed peoples, from the emerging nations of Latin America to the restive populations of Eastern Europe, directly challenging the authority of long-established empires and entrenched monarchies. The very idea that ordinary people could successfully rise up and completely overthrow a powerful, deeply rooted regime gave tangible hope to those living under tyranny everywhere. Yet alongside its undeniably inspiring legacy of liberation and the advancement of human rights, the French Revolution also stands as a stark, grim and enduring cautionary tale concerning the profound and ever-present dangers of unchecked political extremism and the terrifying, often uncontrollable consequences of state-sanctioned violence. The tragic descent of the revolution into the dark period known as the Reign of Terror, where noble revolutionary ideals were tragically and cynically twisted to justify mass executions and the systematic suppression of fundamental human liberties, serves as a chilling and timeless reminder of how easily even the most noble aspirations can be corrupted by fear, suspicion, and the intoxicating allure of absolute power. The relentless pursuit of an abstract virtue through the brutal instrument of terror, the widespread use of summary justice, and the pervasive atmosphere of paranoia starkly demonstrated the perilous path of revolutionary zeal when it becomes untempered by moderation. In the final, considered analysis, the French Revolution remains one of history's most profoundly complex, undeniably pivotal, and fiercely debated transformative events. It was, without question, a period of truly extraordinary hope and simultaneously of unspeakable horror. An era of remarkable, breathtaking progress in human rights and concurrently of devastating, tragic setbacks into barbarity. It irrevocably swept away an archaic, deeply unjust and fundamentally rotten social order, unleashing powerful dynamic forces of nationalism, secularism and popular sovereignty that would profoundly shape the subsequent trajectory of modern history, not just within the borders of France, but across the entire globe. While the ambitious dream of creating a perfect republic of virtue ultimately proved elusive and was often tragically betrayed, the revolution's core assertions about inherent human rights and the fundamental power of the people to determine their own collective destiny continue to inspire and challenge us even today. The French Revolution fundamentally reshaped the nation, abolished feudal dues, and redistributed land. Its administrative reforms and the Napoleonic Code persist today. The revolution inspired global movements for self-determination and social justice, but also serves as a cautionary tale of political extremism and state-sanctioned violence. It remains a complex, pivotal event symbolizing both hope and horror, progress and setbacks. Its legacy of human rights and popular sovereignty continues to inspire. Like and subscribe for history, geopolitics, economics and more.